Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous, and in this video series we're taking a look at the two vRO clients, the older Java client and the new HTML5 client. In this video in particular, we're going to take a look at how to do debugging in both of those. So let's go to our lab environment, and instead of starting with the HTML5 client, let's switch back over to the Orchestrator client, and here you can see a workflow that I've defined. Now, in honor of all the various countries and locations where the VVork subscribers are coming from, as you can see in this workflow, it says hello in all your different languages. So first schema element says hello, next one says hola, then ni hao, then privyet, and namaste. And each of these schema elements is actually pretty straightforward. I'll show you what they do. The first schema element, the one that says hello, is the most complicated, but it's not that complicated. It's just doing a bunch of system.log messages. Hello, how are you? Well, I hope. Nice and straightforward. All the other schema elements just have a single line of code apiece in which they say hello in their respective languages. So in the older legacy Java-based client, the way you do debugging is you right-click a schema element, such as this scriptable task. You choose toggle breakpoint, and then when you want to run the workflow, you don't run it. Instead, you run it through the debugger. So the key thing I want you to see here when doing debugging using the debugger in the older Java-based client is that the place you set breakpoints is at the level of a schema element. So as this workflow runs, it will run one schema element at a time. The debugger will stop whenever it encounters a element that has debugging breakpoint turned on. And when the workflow is actually stopped at a breakpoint, we can actually view the variables, values, we can change the value of the variables, and so forth. But the granularity of breakpoints in the Java client is schema element. So if I wanted to do a breakpoint on, let's say, this line here, you cannot do that with the older client. In the new client, on the other hand, you can do things like that. So here we have another workflow. Actually, it's essentially the same workflow. I've just created one version under the Java client, one version under the HTML5 client, but this workflow is essentially the same as the other. In the HTML5 client, the newer client, you can set breakpoints on individual lines of code. So for instance, if I have a scriptable task, such as this one here, and go to scripting, if I want to set a breakpoint on line number 5, or any other line, I just go over slightly to the left of the code, click, and now I have a breakpoint set on line 5. Why don't we also set a breakpoint on line number 1? Now I've got a breakpoint there too. And I can do that on whatever schema elements I want. So for instance, go to ni hao and set a breakpoint there. I can set breakpoints on the code on an individual statement by statement basis in scriptable tasks, in actions, in this custom decisions, and so forth. So there's more granularity when it comes to setting breakpoints in the HTML5 client, the newer client. So let's actually run this workflow through the debugger in the HTML5 client. To do so, just like the older client, I'm not going to click run. If I click run, the breakpoints are completely ignored. Instead, I need to remember to click debug. And notice as I run this workflow through the debugger, it will notify me if I need to save the workflow before I can run it through the debugger. So I'll save. And in this particular case here, I've actually set up this workflow with an input parameter that we'll mess around with later on. For right now, it has a single input parameter. It wants to know my name, so I'm going to specify my name. But let's run the workflow through the debugger. And as you can see, it's running the workflow, but it has stopped here on our first breakpoint. Remember, say hello has 2 breakpoints set. It's now on the first breakpoint and stopped. I can tell where it stopped both from the green highlighting and the red diamond. If I click continue, the debugger will continue to run the workflow either until it encounters another breakpoint, such as the one on line number 5, or obviously if we get to the end of the workflow, the workflow will stop running. But let's click continue and watch it run until it hits the next breakpoint. So notice when I clicked continue, it ran to line number 5. If I click continue again, just like it did a moment ago, skipping step lines 2 through 4, it's going to skip line 6 and line 7 because there's no breakpoint on there. It will skip all of the say hola schema element because there's no breakpoints there. If I recall correctly, it's not until this schema element that we have another breakpoint. So let's click continue and watch it run to the next breakpoint. And as you can see, in fact, it ran to the next breakpoint. Again, if I click continue again, it will run until the next breakpoint or until it gets to the end of the workflow. So let's actually do that. I click continue again, the workflow starts running once again, and it runs to completion. So having done that, let's actually go back to our workflow again, look at its schema, and see what else we can do here. Well, we're going to run the workflow once again with the same breakpoint set. So notice again, my say hello scriptable task still has its 2 breakpoints set, and if I go to say ni hao, it still has its 1 breakpoint. I'm going to run this through the debugger again. And again, it wants to know my name, so I'll type my name. We'll click run. And it runs the workflow until it encounters a breakpoint. Once again, it's reached say hello. It's hit the first line of the say hello scriptable task, and it's stopped because there's a breakpoint set there. In the last example, I clicked on continue, which caused the workflow to continue to run until it hit the next breakpoint. But notice instead, we have other buttons here, such as step into, which allow us to, if we choose step into, run to the next line of code and stop. If I click step into again, it runs to the next line of code and stops. Step into, it runs and stops. And again, I can keep doing that all the way through this workflow. If I keep doing step into, I can go line by line, step by step. If I say step into again and again, it will continue stepping line by line through the scriptable task. And if I continue to step into, it will jump into the next schema element. So it should now go into say hello. It stopped on the one and only line there. If I click step into again, it will get to the next scriptable task. And in this case, there happens to be a breakpoint, and so we stop there. Now, I'm going to go ahead once again and continue. And as you can see here, it once again has run through the whole workflow. Now, let me show you one other thing real briefly here with the same workflow. I'm going to click on debug. I'll once again specify my name. And notice that when I run the workflow this time, it stops as usual in the same old place. But if I want to, I can choose step over. Step over is going to step over this the scriptable task that I'm in, or the schema element that I'm in, and watch where it lands. So I'm clicking step over. It steps over the schema element that I'm in, and you'll notice it stops on the very next schema element. In this case, it happens to also be a scriptable task. So step over is useful when you want to leave the schema element that you're in and have the debugger stop at the next schema element. So I'm going to allow this to continue running to completion. And let's, in a moment here, talk about why are we bothering to set these endpoints. So once again, I'm going to go into the workflow. I'll debug it once again, and once again, I'll supply my name. I'll run the workflow, and every time we stop on a specific breakpoint, we have the opportunity to go investigate any input parameters or output parameters or attributes that we've set up in the workflow. Now, in this particular example here, this workflow has an input parameter, but I haven't done any variable binding, and therefore none of these schema elements, including this one, none of them can actually see that variable or any other variable. So in the context of this schema element, there are no variables that we could see. If there were, we would see variables listed here. We could see their value, and if we wanted to, we could even change the value. But with no variables accessible in the context of the scriptable task, it's kind of boring, because all we can do is take a look. We'll always see this workflow entry here, which gives us information about who started the workflow, what the name of the workflow is, what the ID of the workflow is, and so forth. But what we're really interested in here is not this workflow business, but rather variables. Because if we have variables that can be seen by this schema element, we'll be able to see their values. We'll be able to change their values. And additionally, we can also set up what's known as watch expressions to see what's going on with those values. So I'm going to change this workflow a little bit. Let me actually let this workflow run to completion. So I'll hit continue a few more times. And we're going to go back and modify this workflow slightly. I'm going to go to the schema for our workflow, and so that I can see the input parameter that I've defined, I will, interesting. I have no input parameter, but I can create that very quickly. It's easy to create an input parameter. I want this input parameter called name. I want it to be a string. I'll click create. Incidentally, if you're wondering how I was seeing an input parameter if I didn't have an input parameter, that actually has to do with the input form. I had left the input form around from a previous run through this workflow. So now I have an input parameter that should be visible, and furthermore, again, the input form, which is like the older Orchestrator client's presentation tab, says that we want to have this variable. Anyways, now that I have this input parameter called name, I can go to the schema and make that variable visible by different schema elements, such as say hello. I'm going to go to say hello. I'm going to set up its inputs so that it can see the input parameter called name. Now the reason why I'm doing this is watch what happens when I run the workflow again this time, again through the debugger. When we run this through the debugger, saving if necessary, again, the input parameter asks us what my name is, so I'll say Brian. I'll run the workflow, and notice that as it runs the workflow and encounters different breakpoints, it appears I've lost my breakpoint. Let me go back and make certain that breakpoint is set again. So here's my scriptable task. There we go. So I got some breakpoints set again. Notice this time when I run through the workflow through the debugger and type my name, the name variable is an input parameter, but that name variable is visible within the debugger. So I can see name and I can see its value, and if I wanted to, I could even change its value. Plus I can also set up expressions to watch for things. I'll show you an example of this in a short little bit with a different workflow. But if I run this workflow through to completion, I'll click continue a few times here again. It runs through the workflow, happy as can be. But we're going to change this workflow just a bit here. I'm going to go to the schema. I'm going to go to say hello. I'm going to go to its scripting, and we're going to add one more line of code that says system.log your name. Actually, let's make it hello, comma, and then it's going to say the name of the person who ran the workflow, or whatever name we specify when we start the workflow. And you'll notice here that the new HTML5 client code editor has context-sensitive type-ahead help for us here. But I'm just going to go with this line of code, add a semicolon. I'll save the workflow, and again, I'm going to run the workflow through the debugger. Again, it asks me for my name. I run the workflow, and when the workflow runs, as it goes through and hits the various breakpoints, I can see what the value is of that name variable. Again, if I continue running it, it'll stop at the next breakpoint. And after I continue from that breakpoint, it's going to log hello, comma, and since the value of name is Brian, it's going to say hello, comma, Brian. So let's actually run that workflow through to completion. And if we go look at the Logs tab, you'll notice it says all the things it said it was going to say. So hello, how are you? Well, I hope. And in this case here, it says hello, Brian, because that's what the user specified when they ran that workflow. But with the debugger, I can do things like this. I can have a variable, so I'm going to run this through the debugger again. I can have a variable such as this input parameter, or it could be an attribute, but I can have a variable that has some value while the workflow is running. Currently, name is equal to Brian according to our debugger. And if I continue running and hit the next breakpoint, name is still Brian, but I can actually change the value of input parameters by clicking this pencil icon. If I want to, I can change it from my first name to my last name. Helps if I type it correctly. And now I've dynamically changed the value of that input parameter. If I continue running the workflow to completion and go look at the Logs tab, once again it says, hello, how are you? Well, I hope. But now it says, hello, Watrous, because the debugger has enabled me to change the value of a variable on the fly. All right, I think that's enough with this particular workflow. Let me go back to the workflow, close it out, and we're going to take a look at another workflow. So we'll click on Library Workflows. The other workflow is called Another Workflow. Here's the workflow, and I am opening up the workflow. Now, one of the things I want to show you in this workflow, well, let's take a look at the code for the scriptable task. So in this case here, if I want to, I can set breakpoints, such as I've already set one here, or I could set breakpoints wherever I want. But I can also set breakpoints on other types of schema elements that make use of JavaScript code. For instance, this predefined schema element called system.log has code associated with it. So if I want to, I can set a breakpoint here too. I could set breakpoints in the JavaScript code in decisions, in the JavaScript code in actions, and other places like that. The HTML5 editor allows me to set breakpoints on JavaScript lines. But what about this schema element? This schema element, for those of you who are new to the HTML5 vRO client, this is the workflow calling schema element. And if we look at it, you'll notice that there is no script, so I can't set a breakpoint on it. If I attempt to use the old Java vRO client's technique of right-clicking the schema element, I don't see any selection here to turn on a breakpoint. In fact, all I'm seeing here is a browser pop-up window. So how do I do debugging on a schema element such as this one here when it has no JavaScript code? Well, let me illustrate. If I click on debug and run the workflow, this workflow wants to rename a virtual machine. So let me pick an existing virtual machine. So I'm browsing through the vCenter inventory, looking for a VM. Here's a virtual machine called My Virtual Machine. I'll click select and I'll give it a new name. My newly, renamed, my typing is horrible today, renamed virtual machine. Okay, let's fix that typo. And I'm going to run this workflow. If I continue to run this workflow by clicking continue, it will run through the rest of this code in this scriptable task because there's no breakpoints. It will run through all of the JavaScript in this system log schema element, and it will run all the way through this schema element that actually renames the virtual machine and will run to completion. If I hit continue, it isn't going to stop anywhere else because there's no more JavaScript code with breakpoints. But that's not quite what I want. What I'd like to do is to be able to have this workflow stop on this schema element here. Well, I could use step into to step through one line of code at a time, but if I've got lots of lines of code, that's not going to be very useful. So what I'm going to do instead is click on step over and observe. Right now we're on the scriptable task, but when I click step over, Step over means jump over all the remaining code in the scriptable task and jump to the next schema element. So now I've stopped here, but again, if I want to stop on the workflow schema element, I simply need to click step over once again. It will stop on that scriptable task, on the workflow element. It's actually, the purpose of that workflow element is to call rename virtual machine. So it's jump to rename virtual machine, and I'm in the JavaScript code that we encounter in there. So I've actually managed to stop on that last schema element in our workflow. And again, I can continue running the workflow to completion if I so desire. So again, that's one other thing to know about these debugging capabilities. Again, in the HTML5 editor, you don't right-click and set a breakpoint on this thing, but you can step over to land on it. And incidentally, let me do a little bit of cleanup work here. This workflow element calls rename virtual machine. So I'm just going to change its label to make it a little more obvious what's going on here. Now, there's one other thing I want to show you real quickly here. So let me run the workflow one more time through the debugger. And again, we'll pick a virtual machine to rename because that's what this workflow does. So I'll just quickly pick another virtual machine. Actually, it's the same VM. We're just going to rename it again. So I picked my newly renamed virtual machine, and I'm going to change its name back to my virtual machine. I'll run the workflow. It'll stop on the first breakpoint. And what I want to do is just give you a quick introduction to the concept of watch expressions. Now, there's lots of things I can do here. When I click the Add Watch Expression button, I can type essentially any JavaScript expression that I want to here, although some may be more useful than others. For instance, if I type, let's type Greek letter, that's the name of a variable in my workflow. Greek letter, is it equal to delta? If I save that and continue running the workflow, right now, Greek letter is not equal to delta, so the value of that expression is false. But if I continue running the workflow, keep an eye on value, if I step into the next line of code, Greek letter is still not delta. If I step into again, Greek letter is still not delta, so the value is still false. If I step into one more time, you might expect the value to be true, because I'm on a line that says Greek letter equals delta, but that line of code, Greek letter equals delta, hasn't run yet. So the value is still false, but if I click step into, after that line of code has run, you'll notice that Greek letter is now delta, and therefore the value is true. And if I continue stepping into one more time, now the value is false because Greek letter is no longer equal to delta. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with the watch expression. That's just one example to get you started. Okay, doke. So speaking of getting you started, there's lots more that you can do with the debugger in the HTML5 client, but the main recap here for me, my favorite new feature of the HTML5 editor is the fact that it allows me to do line-by-line breakpoints. All right, so that takes us to the end of this video. In the next video, what I want to do is show you a bit of the differences between the old vRO client and the new vRO client in terms of how you search for and run workflows. So I'll see you in the next video.